On August 1, 2008, a group of 25 climbers began their ascent of K2 under clear skies, unaware that the next 48 hours would become one of the deadliest episodes in mountaineering history. 11 lives were lost, and the survivors were left to question, what went so tragically wrong on the savage mountain? K2, towering at 8,611 meters, is not just any mountain. It's a beast, a monolith of rock and ice that has claimed more than 80 lives since climbers first attempted to conquer it. Often overshadowed by Mount Everest, K2 is, in many ways, more challenging and dangerous. Where Everest offers several routes to the top, each with varying degrees of difficulty, K2 has no easy path. Every route is hard. Its steep slopes rise at 45-degree angles or more, covered in a mix of limestone and ice that makes every step precarious. A single misstep can send a climber tumbling thousands of meters down. And it's not just the terrain that poses a threat. K2 has its own weather system, a volatile mix of winds and storms that can turn a sunny day into a deadly blizzard within minutes. The chance of dying from a fall or being hit by an icefall is disproportionately high compared to other peaks. Despite these dangers, or perhaps because of them, K2 draws climbers from around the world. For many, it's the ultimate challenge. Reaching the summit of K2 is not just an accomplishment, it's a badge of honor. But that badge comes with a heavy price, as the events of August 1, 2008 would tragically demonstrate. On that day, 25 climbers set out from Camp 4, located at 7,800 meters, with their sights set on the summit. The weather was perfect, clear skies, little wind, and temperatures that, while frigid, were manageable. It was the kind of day climbers dream of, especially on a mountain like K2, where good weather is a rare gift. But as the climbers would soon discover, good weather doesn't always mean a safe ascent. The ascent of K2 is a race against time. Climbers must reach the summit and descend before the weather turns or before darkness falls. Once night descends, the mountain becomes an even more dangerous place, with temperatures plummeting and visibility reduced to almost nothing. But on this day, a series of delays would push the climber's schedule far beyond what was safe. One of the biggest challenges on K2 is the bottleneck, a steep, narrow couloir that climbers must pass through to reach the summit. It's the most dangerous section of the climb. The bottleneck is notorious for its hanging seracs, massive blocks of ice that can break off without warning, sending tons of ice crashing down onto the climbers below. To make matters worse, the bottleneck is so steep that there's little room to maneuver. Climbers must move quickly, yet cautiously, knowing that any delay could be deadly. As the morning of August 1st began to unfold, the treacherous bottleneck section of K2 became a scene of mounting chaos. Among the 25 climbers who had set out from Camp 4 in the early hours were members from various expeditions. 3 from Norway, 4 from the Dutch Norrit team, 6 South Koreans, 3 Serbians, 2 Americans, 1 Frenchman, and 2 solo climbers from Spain and Italy. In this mix was Dren Mandic, a Serbian climber who found himself in a precarious position. Struggling with the brutal conditions and the pressure of the climb, Mandic made a critical decision. He unclipped from the fixed rope, possibly to adjust his oxygen system or to pass another climber. This seemingly simple action led to disaster. In an instant, Mandic lost his balance and began to fall. Those who were nearby could only watch in horror as Mandic tumbled uncontrollably down the steep slope, his body spinning wildly out of control as it descended the bottleneck. Mandic's fall was long and terrifying, but incredibly, when he finally came to a stop, he was still alive. Climbers observing from Camp 4 saw him stand up, leading them to believe he had somehow survived the brutal fall unscathed. But moments later, Mandic collapsed again. This time, he didn't get up. The mountain had claimed its first victim of the day, but tragically, he would not be the last. Now, 24 climbers remain. The news of Mandic's fall spread quickly among the remaining climbers. The reality of K2's dangers became painfully clear, and the day was only beginning. Shortly after Mandic's fall, Meyer and Strang, both members of the American team who were at Camp 4, received a frantic radio call reporting that Mandic was still moving. With a mix of dread and duty, they decided to climb back up to see if they could offer any help. Meanwhile, 2 of Mandic's Serbian teammates and a Pakistani high-altitude porter, Hap, Mohammed Hussein, were already making their way down to where Mandic lay. Upon reaching him, they realized the grim truth. Mandik had died from the fall. Despite the clear signs that Mandik was beyond help, the Serbians, following orders from their team leader at base camp, decided to try and bring Mandik's body back to Camp 4. They were joined by Frederick Strong and Jahan Beg, and another Pakistani Hap, who had initially been hired to help the Serbian team, but had been released for reasons no one could quite figure out. Beg was later hired by French climber Hugues Daubared at the last minute, and he had joined the group heading up the mountain. However, Beg was already showing signs of exhaustion and anxiety, adding a layer of concern to an already precarious situation. As the group prepared to lower Mandik's body down to Camp 4, Strang began to notice Beg's increasingly erratic behavior. Beg seemed disoriented, first offering to help in the rescue, then refusing, and moments later returning to assist again. It became clear that Beg was suffering from high-altitude sickness, his actions growing more confused and dangerous as the group struggled to lower the body. The plan was simple: lower Mandik's body down the slope, wrapped in a sleeping bag. But the steep angle and the body's weight made the task far more treacherous than anticipated. Beg, who was holding onto the rope tied to Mandik's body, became increasingly nervous. A few sudden jerks from the body's weight caused Beg to lose his footing. He bumped into Strang, panicking as he grabbed for the ropes attached to the body, then at Strang, who shouted to release the rope. Beg hesitated, but finally let go of the rope. He began to slide down the slope uncontrollably, gaining speed with every second. To everyone's horror, Beg did not attempt to stop his slide using the self-arrest technique, a standard mountaineering maneuver that could have given him a fighting chance. Instead, he rocketed headfirst over the edge of a massive cornice, disappearing into the abyss below. By 12:30 p.m., the devastating news of the second casualty reached Camp 4. The fall of Jahan Beg was a harsh reminder of the unforgiving nature of K2. The number of climbers had now dwindled to 23. Following this shocking loss, the Serbian climbers decided to abandon their mission of bringing Mandik's body down. Instead, they wrapped it in their country's flag, anchored it to the mountainside with an ice axe, and began their descent back to Camp 4. Strang later reflected on the situation, stating that, had he known Mandik was already dead, he would never have risked his life in an attempt to bring him down. It's an unspoken rule in mountaineering. When a climber is immobile, trying to move them can often result in further tragedy. Nicholas Rice, a climber with the French team who had been delayed, also made the difficult decision to descend at that point. The death of Jahan Beg underscored the perils of attempting to move a dead or incapacitated climber on a mountain like K2. The team's morale was shattered, yet the summit still called to those who remained. At the back of the line, Wilco van Rooyen, Cas van de Gevel, and Gerard McDonnell grew increasingly frustrated as the group's progress slowed to a crawl. In such a high-altitude traffic jam, there was no way to move faster than the slowest climbers. Pemba, an experienced mountaineer climbing without supplemental oxygen, watched in dismay as an exhausted Korean climber took nearly an hour to move just a few paces up the rope. As the group finally made it through the traverse and out from beneath the overhang, it was already 2:30 p.m. They had lost 6 crucial hours in the bottleneck, but the lure of the summit was too strong. None of the climbers turned back. As they approached the final pitch toward the summit, doubts crept in. The ropes were questionable at best. The trailbreakers had found a section of climbing rope made out of 8mm cord, left behind from the previous season. The line had spent a year exposed to the brutal elements and intense ultraviolet radiation at 27,000 feet. But it was all they had. Norwegian climber Rolf Bay, grappling with the difficult decision, chose to turn back just 100 meters below the summit. However, he urged his wife, Cecilia Skog, and their friend Nessa to continue the ascent. As they pressed on, Bay waited just above the traverse, keeping a watchful eye on their progress. Tragically, Cecilia later witnessed her husband being swept off the mountain during a sudden icefall. Now, only 22 climbers were left. The first to reach the summit was Alberto Zarain, a Basque climber who had set a blistering pace. He summited at 3 p.m., later encouraging the Norwegian team that it was only an hour more to the top. One by one, the climbers reached the summit, each arrival a mix of exhaustion and elation. But by the time the last climber, Marco Confortola, made it to the top at 7:30 p.m., the day was already fading. The sun was setting, and darkness was rapidly descending on K2. By 8:30 p.m., the mountain was shrouded in darkness. The descent was about to begin. And with it, the true horror of the day's events would unfold. Among them were Van de Gevel and Hugues d'Aubaret, who began their descent from the summit around 7:30 p.m. Hugues, noticeably sluggish and disoriented, struggled to keep pace. The lack of bottled oxygen had taken its toll on him, and the realization that he might not have enough to make it back to Camp 4 weighed heavily on his mind. His porter, Meherban Karim, who was last seen at the summit, had mysteriously disappeared. Hugues signaled for Van de Gevel to go ahead of him, perhaps sensing that he would only slow him down. As Van de Gevel carefully navigated the treacherous bottleneck in the dark, he suddenly heard a thud and a tumbling sound. A human form hurtled past him, plummeting into the abyss below. He believed it was Hugues, who had succumbed to exhaustion and the brutal conditions. With Karim and Hugues gone, 20 climbers remained. Meanwhile, Marco Confortola, bivouacked further down, reported hearing screams and seeing faint headlamps flicker and vanish after a deafening roar echoed through the Serac field. It's believed that the climber both men witnessed was indeed Hugues, who had run out of oxygen hours before and was too exhausted to continue safely. Van de Gevel eventually made it to Camp 4, but it was late, far too late. While climbing K2 is undeniably dangerous, it's often the descent that proves fatal. Prolonged exposure in the death zone, where oxygen levels are critically low, leads to severe hypoxia. Climbers become disoriented, confused, and physically weak, making every step a potential last. Early the next morning, above the traverse, Wilco van Rooyen gave up searching for the fixed ropes and decided to descend alone. His vision was failing, and he feared he was going snowblind, a death sentence on the mountain. Desperate to survive, he knew he needed to get off the mountain quickly. Confortola and McDonald, however, didn't follow him immediately. As Van Rooyen descended, he encountered the remaining Korean climbers and their guide, Umik Bote. The men were tangled in a nightmarish web of ropes, some hanging upside down, bloodied but still alive. It wasn't clear what had caused their predicament, whether a second Serac fall, an avalanche, or a regular fall had left them ensnared, but cutting the ropes would mean certain death for the trapped climbers. Van Rooyen, realizing he could do little to help, handed his spare gloves to Umik Bote, who informed him that a rescue mission was already underway from Camp 4. Knowing his life depended on it, Van Rooyen continued his descent, leaving the tangled group behind. At Camp 4, Pemba was taking photos of the hanging climbers. The Korean leader, Mr. Kim, proposed a rescue mission, but the American team lacked the manpower to assist. Determined, Mr. Kim sent 2 Sherpas, Tsering Bote and Pasang Bote, to rescue the 3 Koreans and their guide, who was their relative. Later that morning, Confortola and McDonald reached the Korean group and worked tirelessly to free them from their ropes. Confortola managed to grab a radio from the hanging Sherpa and called for help, stating that he was too exhausted to continue. The Koreans were at least repositioned into a more comfortable state, though they remained entangled. Confortola, his energy spent, began his descent, while Gerard McDonald opted to stay behind and continue the rescue. Alone, McDonald climbed up to find the anchor points trapping the Koreans, a heroic effort that would be his last. He worked several hours to free the men from the ropes before disaster struck again. Around noon, Tsering Bote and Pasang Bote reached the bottom of the bottleneck, where they found Marco Confortola crawling on his hands and knees, utterly exhausted. They quickly radioed Pemba, urging him to come up and assist, as Confortola was nearing the end of his strength. Having been on the mountain for more than 30 hours, Confortola eventually fell asleep on the slope. As Confortola slept, a massive avalanche tore through the bottleneck, just meters from where he lay. When he awoke, he saw the partially buried body of a climber in the snow and ice, later believed to be Gerard McDonald, who had been swept away by the avalanche. The group was now down to 19 climbers. Later, around 2 p.m., Pasang Bote radioed Pemba again to report that the Koreans and their guide, who had been freed earlier by McDonald, were finally descending the bottleneck. However, tragedy struck again as another Serac fall swept away the 3 Koreans, their Sherpa, and one of the rescuing Sherpas. Only Tsering Bote, who had been climbing more slowly, escaped. Back at Camp 4, Pemba found himself alone in his determination to rescue Confortola, who was still struggling beneath the bottleneck. Despite the dangers, Pemba set out alone. As he reached Confortola and began tending to him, another massive ice chunk fell from the serac above. The icefall tragically killed the 3 Koreans, their Sherpa, and the Sherpa who had been sent to rescue them. The number of climbers had now dwindled to just 14. Despite the chaos and loss around them, Pemba managed to help the half-conscious Confortola down the mountain. Confortola, exhausted and suffering from severe frostbite, had spent more than 30 hours exposed to K2's harsh conditions. Meanwhile, Wilco had managed to descend the bottleneck, but his vision was deteriorating rapidly, and he was disoriented in the darkness. With no clear idea of where he was on the mountain, his only hope was to keep moving down. Using his radio, he called for help from his colleagues at Camp 4, but communication was difficult due to his worsening condition. Pemba joined Cas van de Gavel in a desperate attempt to intercept Wilco near Camp 3. Guided by radio instructions from Klinka, who was watching through a telescope at base camp, they finally located Wilco. He had survived more than 40 hours exposed to K2's brutal elements, suffering from snowblindness, dehydration, and severe frostbite. By late evening on August 3rd, Pemba, Cas, and Wilco reached base camp. Wilco received immediate medical attention for his frostbitten toes and hands. Eventually, Marco Confortola was rescued and, along with Wilco and Cas, were evacuated, all of them barely alive after their harrowing ordeal. As the surviving climbers regrouped at base camp, they shared a final can of beer that Gerard MacDonald had saved to celebrate his successful return. It was a bitter moment, filled with memories of their fallen friends. Marco Confortola, who had spent 4 grueling days on the mountain, was the last to be airlifted out. K2 had claimed 11 lives that season, a stark reminder of why it's called the Savage Mountain. The mountain wouldn't be summited again until 2011, but the memory of those lost in 2008 would linger long in the hearts of those who survived.